who better than Tim Peake? So, hi, Tim.
Hello, good morning, and good morning to everybody who's joining us again this week for another Tim Talk Space. So thanks for all those brilliant questions last week as well. We really enjoyed it. Some great questions coming in, and so looking forward to another session this morning.
So we had so many questions, actually several hundred questions, and a huge number of them were talking about isolation and confinement, hardly surprisingly, as well as lots of other aspects of living and working in space. So we managed to persuade Tim to do an extra session this week. We were going to do them every 2 weeks, but Tim's agreed to join us today to get through a few more of them. Now, last week, Tim, you emphasized the importance of routine to structure your day. So we thought it might be really good if you could spend a few minutes just talking us through what a typical day is like on the International Space Station.
Absolutely, yes. And loads of questions were kind of related to this. So I thought if I just spend about 5 minutes and I'll just take you through, what's it like, a day in the life of an astronaut on board the ISS. So I'm just going to share my screen with you here. And hopefully if all goes well, you will see a PowerPoint, and you should, in a second. There you go. Hopefully you can see the International Space Station there now in all its glory. Probably the greatest feat of human engineering. 400 tons of hardware. It's the size of a football pitch when you look at that out towards the solar panels. It's got about 16 pressurized modules in it. Inside, although you think we're living in a tiny tin can and we're all squeezed up and it's very confined, actually it's about the size of a 747 jumbo jet inside the space station. So we're quite fortunate. We do actually have a reasonable amount of space, although of course we are quite confined and cooped up. But that's it, the International Space Station in all its glory. So what's it like a day in the life? Well, we get up. There's me on the left-hand side in my crew quarter. And you can see I've just zipped up. It looks like I'm standing up, but of course there's no up or down in space. And actually my crew quarter was in the floor, in the decking area. But we had a crew quarter in the overhead. We had one on the left wall and one on the right wall. So I'm just there in my sleeping bag. I've got myself zipped up. I used to like having my arms inside my sleeping bag so that they didn't just float up during the night and bang on something or wake me up. And you can see it's not that big. It's about the size of an old telephone box. But we'd wake up at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And the first thing I would do was actually just to switch on my computers, which are right next door to me, there where I'm sleeping, and check the schedule. Because whilst we're sleeping at night, there's an entire team at Mission Control who are preparing our day's activity. And whilst we're sleeping, some things are changing. Some experiments might be being brought forward, some might be delayed, small changes to the schedule. So first thing, get up, check that, make sure that I know exactly what I'm doing for the day, and then go and have a wash. It's just a kind of hot water in a wet flannel there, a shave, electric razor. And we always used to shave next to the air vent so that any spare bristles and stuff would just get sucked into the air vent there, and it wouldn't just float around inside the space station causing pollution. And then go and have breakfast with my crewmates. That's Tim Copra, Jeff Williams there. And we would just have breakfast and chat about what we were going to do for the day. Now, the first thing we have to do is start at 7 o'clock with a call to all the mission control centers around the world. So that top map just shows you how many places are involved in space station operations. We'd start with Houston, then we go on to Huntsville, where we talk about science activities, over to Munich in Germany, talking about the European elements, bounce over to Tsukuba, just outside of Tokyo in Japan, talking about the Japanese experiments, and then back to Moscow, where we talk about the Russian experiments. That sounds like an awful lot, but actually we'd normally get through that in about 15 minutes. It's just a kind of quick tag up around the world with all of those stations. And then we'd have, this is us in the daily planning conference. That's just Tim and I there chatting away, listening to what the activity is going to be like for that day. This is what our schedule looks like. So this is an average day. You can see on the left-hand side, you've got the names of the crew members. There's Scott Kelly, Sergey, Yuri Malenchenko, Tim Copra, myself. And then we have a whole host of things that we have to do. Along the very top there, you can see the timeline. We've got GMT, we've got Munich, we've got Houston. We all work to GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. So the space station right now is an hour behind British summertime. So It's just gone 11:30. They're at 10:35 on board the space station this morning. And as we get our activities completed, we click them gray, we gray them out, and we have a red line that marches across the schedule so that we know whether we're ahead of schedule or whether we're behind schedule. We're always being chased by this big red line. You're trying to keep on time, trying to get everything done on time as well as we work through. So what are we doing? Well, actually, of course, we're up there to do lots of science activities. These are some photographs of some of the life science activities I was involved in, investigations into the human body. So the morning would be very, very busy, lots of different science activities, sometimes maintenance activities going on as well. This is a particularly busy maintenance activity on the space station. You think if you look behind your television sometimes, you think there's a lot of cables back there. Well, you haven't seen anything until you go on board the space station. There are thousands and thousands, miles and miles and miles of cables. This was one particular day where Tim Peake and myself had to rewire some major elements of the space station. So we might be involved in lots of maintenance activities or lots of science activities. And then it's time for a spot of lunch. Lunch is normally a solitary affair, actually. We're always so busy and we normally work as individuals, but we kind of just grab lunch when we can. And lunch is also a time to try and catch up if we're a little bit late in some of our morning activities. So there's me just having a quick bite to eat. I've warmed up some food in the food warmer. That's just like a metal pouch there. That's probably looks like some pasta or beef stew or something. And then it's on with the afternoon activities. Now, the afternoon activities will often be the same as the morning, it'll be maintenance and science, but sometimes we'll have major activities going on board the space station. So maybe we're doing a satellite launch, for example. On the top left picture, there's a small satellite being launched by the robotic arm, or maybe we've got a visiting cargo vehicle. Now, when one of the cargo vehicles comes up, that's 3.5 tons worth of cargo that all needs unloading, and then we need to pack that back in with all of our rubbish and experiments. If it's a SpaceX and it's actually coming back to Earth, it's experiments. If it's not a SpaceX, then it'll burn up in the atmosphere, so we just pack our cargo vehicles with rubbish. Or maybe we've got an upcoming spacewalk and we're really working hard to get ready for that. So that's not necessarily an average day on the space station, but often these major activities are going ahead. And then what we do every day, of course, is exercise. We probably have a couple of hours, maybe in the afternoon. I used to like exercise in the afternoon, where we're either doing cardio training to get our heart rate up, to keep our heart and our vascular system very fit and healthy, or we're doing weight training to keep our muscles and our bones in good order as well. Evenings, we always like to come together as a crew if you can. It's just nice, to have that social interaction, to speak to your crewmates about your day, find out how it's all going. And then if you've got spare time in the evening, maybe you'll be calling friends and family. Maybe you'll be actually watching a bit of television, who knows, doing something to unwind and something to relax. This is something I used to love doing, and that was going to the cupola window and taking photographs. So I was just going to spend a minute just taking on a quick orbit of planet Earth. That's me there looking down on Earth, and this is the view you're going to see. Absolutely stunning. And what's strange here is, I'm sure you can see, is you don't actually see signs of human habitation down there. What's beautiful is you see all of the Earth's geology, the sort of natural features of our planet that's been forming over 4 billion years that stand out. There's the Himalaya mountains there. So somewhere in the middle is Mount Everest. Can't quite see it myself, but I did manage to take a few photos of Everest. But mountains are lovely from space. And when we get out the big lenses, you can actually zoom in on beautiful features. This is Patagonia and the southern ice fields. This is up at the northernmost part of our orbit, where we can actually see into the Arctic Circle. So that's Prince William Sound in Alaska, with Mount Denali and Mount Foraker in the background. And then at the southern part of the space station's orbit, we can actually see Antarctica on a clear day. And then about 20 minutes later, we'll be crossing the equator, and you get to see the beautiful tropics of Cuba and Florida there. This is the Sahara Desert, and deserts are beautiful from seeing from space. You don't think of a desert as being a beautiful place on Earth. You think of them being very dry and arid and lifeless, but from space, they're stunning. That's about the size of the United States of America, the Sahara Desert there. And then as we come into the shadow of the Earth, the sun begins to set, it gets low on the horizon, we see that beautiful glint off the water. 16 sunrises and sunsets a day. And this photo here it just shows you how thin our Earth's atmosphere is, where space is black, the Earth is black, and you get that beautiful curvature of the Earth and just our very thin atmosphere. And then all the lights of towns and cities come out as we get into the full shadow of the Earth and we go into the night part of the orbit. This is Cairo looking down the River Nile. So you can see how everybody there is living very close to the river, how water is such an important source for us here on Earth. And the fishing boats in the Sea of Thailand, again, thousands and thousands of fishing boats using those green lights to lure up squid. Thunderstorms, beautiful from space. We get to see the Earth's atmosphere and how dynamic our weather systems are. And that includes, of course, the aurora, which sometimes stretches up as high as the space station, the northern lights and the southern lights. It's wonderful to see from space. And then when we turn the camera out towards the Milky Way, we get to see that strip of 100 billion stars that make up our home galaxy. Seeing that from space is unbelievable. So that just gives you a flavor of a day in the life of the space station. So I hope you enjoyed starting off with that. And Jeremy, back over to you to get going on the questions.
Well, thank you. That was brilliant. And I think it really emphasizes how many different people are involved in a mission like that. If you look at the number of people you speak to during your crew call in the morning, each of them speaks to dozens of other people with expertise in engineering or in physiology or science, whatever it might be. In future weeks, we'll try and come back to some of those. We probably haven't got time today, given how many questions people have been sending in. And I can see lots of questions coming in as we talk. But let's start with some of the questions that are perhaps the most relevant to people stuck at home and being told to wash their hands all the time. Sarah Moxon talks about the fact that astronauts find it difficult to wash their hair, miss the feeling of water and so on, wondering how you wash your clothes. And Thomas, age 7, good question here, how do you clean yourselves in space? And Anya, age 5, really on the money here, wants to know how you wash your hands in space.
Yeah, they're great questions. Let's be honest, you never really feel fully clean in space. I mean, I love a hot shower, and I would have loved to have had a hot shower up in space. We have like a camping wash. So, we will get, after exercise, we will get a towel and we will actually get hot water from the hot water dispenser. And we'll pour hot water into our towel so we get a nice hot wet flannel, and then we can use that to give ourselves a good body wash. And in fact, let me have a look here, because I've probably got some stuff in here to show you. That's a hygiene towel there. So there's actually a towel in a pouch where we can connect that up to the hot water dispenser. We've got things like no rinse shampoo. So, where you don't actually need to rinse your hair after you've used this, and then you can wash your hair. And washing our hands, we just use wet wipes. They're obviously antibacterial wet wipes, and they're the same kind of wet wipes that we can wipe down the space station with once a week to keep it clean. But I really enjoyed that first shower I had back on Earth. Was something to really, really memorable event.
And what about brushing your teeth? That's a question that we've got coming in this afternoon.
Yeah, brushing your teeth was very straightforward. You just use it the same method, but we would just swallow our toothpaste. There's really nowhere to spit it out. So you just brush your teeth with a small amount of toothpaste and then take a rinse of water and swallow it all down.
And cutting your hair. I seem to remember seeing pictures of you with a really sharp haircut. Who did that?
Yeah, I used to cut my own hair. Some crew members cut each other's hair, but frankly, it's quite easy to do in space, and we're not really interested in what it looks like that much. I would just simply get the clippers. I'd go for a number 3 or a number 4 at the sides, and then get the number 6 and go over the top with a number 6 there, and job was done. And of course, that hose is connected up to a vacuum cleaner. So as you're cutting your hair, all the bits of hair are being sucked into the vacuum cleaner, and then we can just clean that out, put it in the rubbish bag, and the rubbish bag ends up going in a cargo vehicle that then burns up in the atmosphere. I probably spend, I probably wouldn't want to cut my hair like that too often down here on Earth.
But I assume then in the Peake household, you're the trained hairdresser, are you?
I've been cutting my boys' hair. Yes, I'm not sure whether they like it or not. And yeah, I still do, my own at the sides and the back, and then Rebecca, my wife, helps me on the top.
I could do some lessons. I'm afraid I'm getting a bit fed up of this. Sleeping in space, lots of questions came in around this one. You've answered some of them already. We've seen where you sleep and the fact that you're in a sleeping bag. But we've got a question from Thomas, who's 4, from Polesworth, who wants to know how easy it is to fall asleep well, he thinks standing up, but it's not really standing up, is it? But particularly when you're strapped into a bed, does that work? And Charlie, who's 10, from Bracknell, wants to know about whether you have to know when to sleep and to be awake, and whether you have to take turns so there's always somebody awake on the space station. That's a really interesting question, I thought.
Yeah, great questions. It does take a while to get used to sleeping. So there's lots really with sleep, because you don't need as much sleep. I don't know why. Perhaps it's because we're not so physically active. 6 hours is you feel like 6 hours is more than enough, whereas on Earth most people like between 7 and 8. And I like to be strapped into my sleeping bag to be reasonably secure. I didn't mind the sleeping bag floating around a little bit. That was fine. But I had sort of zip ties, wire ties that would keep me reasonably secure to the wall, so that I wouldn't go banging my head as I was floating around in my crew quarter. Some people were happy to have their arms outside the sleeping bag. I just thought that felt really unusual when you were sleeping with your arms in front of you. So it does take a while to get used to that, to get used to sleeping in space. But once you get used to it, it's the most comfortable night's sleep ever, because there's no pressure points on your body at all. Really, really good. So yeah, sleeping in space was once you get used to it, was absolutely great. We actually all sleep together as a crew. Nobody's on watch during the night as a crew member. The commander, space station commander, has the emergency alarm in their crew quarter. So if any of the emergency alarms are triggered, that will wake the commander up, and then they'll wake the rest of the crew up. And of course, we've got thousands of people around the world who are monitoring the space station, 24 hours a day. So they would get into radio contact with us as well.
Clearly, sleeping in zero-G is very different from sleeping on the ground, but it must change the way you do everything. I would have thought that, given that nothing weighs anything in space, you must feel like Superman. And if you imagine the huge weights you can probably move around. But we've got a question from Joshua Collis, who asks if you feel weak in space. So I wonder whether he's got an instinct that I'm not aware of. So which of us is right?
It's interesting. I mean, you kind of feel normal in terms of your strength. You're right when we're able to move huge pieces of equipment around by ourselves. You have to be extremely careful when you're doing that. For example, spacesuits. A spacesuit for spacewalking is about 250 kilograms. Now, one person wouldn't be able to lift that very easily on Earth unless you're kind of going for the world's strongest man competition. But in space, I could very easily move a 250 kilogram spacesuit around. But if you build up too much speed, it still has momentum. It might not weigh anything in weightlessness, but it has momentum. And so if it goes too fast, you need to be able to stop that. And so you have to be very, very careful when you're moving massive pieces of equipment around in weightlessness. But you still feel fairly normal in terms of your strength. When we get on the exercise devices, I felt pretty fit and healthy when I was running. I felt pretty strong when I was doing the exercises on the devices. So yeah, I would say you feel pretty normal, but it's nice to be able to move massive pieces of equipment around without having to work too hard.
And I guess you must immediately appreciate what it's like with Newton's laws of motions about forces and masses and acceleration. You actually feel it for yourself rather than trying to interpret what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Lots of questions about isolation, not surprisingly, lockdown and so on, and keeping in touch. So here's a question from Will and his friends at King Stanley Primary School, who want to know if you ever felt locked in or frustrated on the ISS.
Yes, I never felt frustrated. You're always so busy, and there's always lots to do, and there's always that amazing view from the cupola window to see. But you are confined. You do feel locked in, and I was craving nature. I wanted to see, the color green. I wanted to get outside into the fresh air. When I came back down to Earth, I loved that first time I was allowed to go running in the woods and just reconnect with planet Earth. So from that point of view, you do feel cooped up you are inside the space, space station. Even when you get the chance to go out on a spacewalk, you're still confined in your spacesuit. So it can be quite claustrophobic.
Several people have asked about personal items you were able to take with you. Connor, who's 8, and Lewis, who was 6, wanted to know if you were allowed to take any personal items with you, and if so, what you took. And then the children at Year 1 at Abbey School in Torquay, they wanted to know, what items did you take to space with you, and why did you choose them?
So my items were mainly chosen around things that I wanted to do for, if there were outreach programs or things I was supporting, for example, the Prince's Trust or Operation Rally. So I wanted to have these T-shirts so that I could take photos and be involved in various activities. Mission X, we ran from the space station. So my personal box was really full up with T-shirts and things that I wanted, events I wanted to be involved in during my 6 months up there. But we get about a 5 kilogram allowance in a size of about 2 shoe boxes. So it's not huge. And of course, in there were some personal items, some photographs of my family. You probably saw them in my crew quarter. I just sort of pinned them up. So I had those. And so that was nice to have as well.
That's great. A bit nosy of us. I mean, it's your personal bag and everybody else wants to have a look in it, but I'm afraid we're all as bad as each other. So that's really interesting. Thank you. Quite a few people were interested in being scared in space. There were questions, as one has just come in, about how scary it was during the launch. But I think it's actually, in many ways, even more interesting to know about the most dangerous things you encountered in space. Bessie wants to know if you were scared when you went to the ISS. And Harry, age 9, says, is it scary journeying into space? Ebony wants to know what was the scariest moment. George and Lydia want to know if it's ever as scary in space because it's so dark. So a whole lot of questions that I guess probably have a similar answer.
Yeah, no, great question. So before you go into space, I mean, yes, going is a scary prospect to sit on top of a 300-ton rocket and launch yourself up to 25 times the speed of sound. So you've got to be comfortable with doing that. And I think the way that astronauts, we address that is we train. And it's very similar to how I, when I was a test pilot, how I worked. You train and train and train. And you also really try and understand the risk. You don't shy away from it. You don't kind of pretend it's not going to happen. You confront every possibility, every what if this goes wrong, what if that goes wrong, and you come up with options so that you know that you're in a position to be able to do something about it if things go wrong. And that's really what means that you can eventually sit on top of that rocket feeling actually remarkably relaxed and comfortable and excited about the journey ahead, rather than sort of trembling with fear or trepidation. We're all raring to go as astronauts at that point. You're absolutely raring to go. You've kind of put your fears behind you, you've addressed them, you've analyzed them, and you've worked out what you can do to resolve them. But having said that, when things do go wrong, then your heart rate goes up, you have a burst of adrenaline, and of course you need to sort things out. We had something go wrong in our space walk with Tim Copra, where we had to get him back in a hurry. And actually at the very beginning of the mission, we had something go wrong with our docking. For me, this was probably the scariest moment actually in the whole mission, was those few moments where our rocket, our spacecraft backed away from the space station. The automatic docking system failed and Yuri had to take manual control, and then he had to fly the spacecraft manually towards the space station. And that was really hard. It wasn't going very well. The sun was reflecting off the space station like a big mirror into his eyes, into the optics, and he couldn't see very clearly the docking port. And Tim Cooper and I realized that we're in trouble. Actually, that was a difficult situation, and Yuri had to back off of that one, regain control of the spacecraft, and then line ourselves up more accurately and bring ourselves back in. And he, thankfully, he was on his 6th mission to space. He was very, very experienced cosmonaut and was able to do a perfect docking on the 2nd attempt. But that was probably the scariest point in space, was just getting that docking right and getting onto the space station.
So I suppose the message is that if you understand enough because you've studied it and researched it and trained and practiced, then things aren't as scary as they might seem because you feel to some extent in control. Is that fair?
Absolutely. It's exactly what we do. We try and gain element of control in our lives. I think that's what we're all trying to do in lockdown, is try and control the things we can control. And don't worry so much. If you can't control it, then, you know, don't worry about it. Analyze it, try and do as much as you can.
There's some questions about physiology, I suppose you'd have to describe them as. In particular, Florence Upton, who's 7, wants to know what happens if you feel sick or poorly in space.
Yes, so we have a fantastic sort of first aid cabinet in space, if you like. Even with you know, defibrillator stretchers for CPR, we can treat astronauts if they come back from a spacewalk and they might be suffering the bends, very similar to a diver. So we're able to even do minor surgery on the space station, removing teeth, sutures, for example. If people have broken bones, we can deal with that. So we're able to deal with a whole host of difficult circumstances. Now, we would do this in conjunction with our flight surgeons. So if somebody had a really bad problem, of course, we would have our flight surgeons on the ground at mission control, and they'd be helping the astronauts on board the space station deal with the injured crew member. But we're all trained to a very high standard of first aid. We actually get to work in hospitals for a few days as part of our astronaut training. We'd normally go and work at various different departments. So ER, emergency kind of activities. We'd go and look at open heart surgery, for example, just to get a feel of, you know, what the body can do and what the body can take. So I did that in Germany, in Cologne, in a hospital, and it was an amazing 3 days doing my medical training.
Few more questions about lockdown. People are interested to know what happens when you come back from the space station at the moment, and see how the world has changed from when they went up, and what happens when they want to see their families. Do you think that's changed from how they would normally do this? Any comments on how they're coping these days with the strange conditions?
Yeah. I think it's going to be very difficult. In fact, I'm talking to Drew Morgan tomorrow, who's just come down in April from he did about an 8-month stint on board the space station, and it will be unusual because one of the things when you come back from space, you're looking forward to doing all those things that you've missed, and of course you're not able to do them. You're not able to go out to nice restaurants, to, you know, go and have a beer and a pizza with your friends or see your family and your loved ones. They will be going into a isolated location with their immediate family, but there'll be an element of quarantine involved as well, which is unusual when you get back from space. We normally quarantine before it. So yes, it is going to be unusual, and like the rest of us, they'll be longing for that to return to some form of normality.
Now, we've just got time for a couple more questions. 2 of my favourites. There have been some amazing questions come in, but I think this one really is an interesting one. It's from Neo, who's 5 years old in London. And he wants to know what surprised you about the space station when you arrived, even though you went to astronaut school. So we've heard how much training you do, how much studying you do. So you must know absolutely every inch of the space station before you arrive. But I bet there was still something that surprised you and it wasn't quite how you'd expected it. Was there anything like that?
Well, actually, one of the biggest surprises is that it feels like a home from home. So when you first go on board, it feels really spooky. Because you suddenly think, hang on a second, I've been here before, because your mock-ups are so accurate, so high fidelity. The smell is something different, and it's not an unpleasant smell, I should say. But it's a very unique sort of metallic smell. So that really hits you when you get on board the space station. But I think the biggest surprise is weightlessness, because it's your whole mind is having to adapt to a new way of living and working, and how your body is feeling, and how all the pieces of equipment you're using. So that's the biggest surprise when you first get on board the space station, is just that entire environment of weightlessness and how much volume you can use. You know, you don't, here on Earth, we use a tiny fraction of the volume available to us in a room that you're sitting in, or when you're on the space station, you can use the entire volume of the space station, which again makes it feel a lot bigger than it really is.
Yeah, I guess the 3-dimensional aspect of it is something you can't really rehearse on the ground. So yeah, that's fascinating. Now, this is, I think, my personal favorite of all of the questions we've had. This is from Ceci Scanlon, who's 4. I can see where she's coming from on this one. She wants to know what happens if you pull a party popper in space.
That is a brilliant question. Do you know what? We haven't had party poppers, I don't think, on the space station. We've had Nerf guns and bullets, but not party poppers. So, I mean, what would happen, of course, is that the streamers wouldn't then fall down to Earth because of gravity. The streamers would just carry on going in the direction they were popped out. But on the space station, our ventilation fans are quite powerful, and they do keep the air flowing kind of from the ceiling to the floor, so that we're constantly recirculating our atmosphere. So the streamers would go into the airflow, and eventually they'd just be sucked into the air return grids. But that would be a great experiment to do. Great question.
Well, there's loads and loads more questions, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to one of your questions during the course of today or last week. But over the next few weeks, we'll try and come back to as many questions that we can fit in as possible, because there are some really good ones, including things about what it's like in space. Is there light in space? What do you think rockets will look like in the future? Things of this sort. So we'll come back to those when we have time over future weeks. But for now, we're going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. If we didn't get your question, then we'll try and come back to it, but do keep sending new ones in. But for now, there's things that you can do at home if you'd like to get involved in space. There's a couple of challenges that are on right now. In fact, the European Space Agency's Moon Camp Challenge starts tomorrow, and that's suitable for anybody up to about age 18. So you get to do a 3D design of a moon base, which is a really exciting prospect. And then there's the Astro Science Challenge. Tim's actually a patron of this. It's a space science learning adventure for children who are between 7 and 11. So they're both things you can do at home. If you want to see where to join in, the details are somewhere down here below the screen. But in the meantime, don't forget that next week we're going to be talking about the rocket science experiment that about a third of all the schools in the country took part in. And we're going to have some expert guests as well as Tim. So join us at the same time next week for Tim Talks Space. Thanks very much for watching, and thank you, Tim, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. It's been great joining you again today. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.